Okay, welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Joel Edmondson. I'm the CEO of the Venue Management Association. We're lucky to be joined today by Jonno White, who I'll introduce in a moment. I'll just begin by acknowledging the country that we're on, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. These digital series are a really great way of connecting VMA members with a range of experts around the country. We're really, really lucky to have Jonno with us today to talk about what is really one of my favourite topics, which is about handling difficult conversations without conflict. I think all of us are a little bit nervous or get a little bit nervous about difficult conversations that we need to have in the workplace. But I think we all know that high performing teams are ones that can be honest and can overcome important issues without putting them on the back burner because they're too uncomfortable to talk about. So Jonno's with us today to talk about some really clear takeaways that you'll be able to go away and use in your teams. Jonno's the co-founder of Clarity Group Global, a consultancy focused on helping leaders and their teams get healthier and clearer than ever before about their purpose, identity, and strategies to achieve their vision. He specializes in facilitating leadership team offsites and coaches CEOs and leaders. Having guided numerous leadership team offsites in locations around the world, Jonno is highly skilled at creating a safe and productive environment where teams can explore their strengths, challenges, and aspirations. Jonno is the author of Step Up or Step Out, read by over 10,000 leaders globally, providing practical guidance on managing difficult employees with grace and dignity. His Leadership Conversations podcast has a global reach with listeners in 150 plus countries. That's almost all the countries in the world.
Yeah, it is.
Just before I say welcome, Jonno, there is a Q&A tab here in Zoom. Jonno's going to take some questions at the end of the session. So if you want to log your questions in there, he'll go through those at the end, and I'll do a bit of a debrief at the end. But over to you, Jonno.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joel. And lovely to be with you all. Let me just share my screen and check that's all working. Awesome. Yeah. So as Joel said, I'm the co-founder of Clarity Group Global. And today, looking at difficult conversations, how to do that without conflict. My book, Step Up or Step Out, how to deal with difficult people, even if you hate conflict, as Joel said, has sold 10,000 copies around the world. I'm also a podcast host that he mentioned, and 240 episodes down, which is very exciting. I also founded the 7 Questions movement, which is online. It's a written survey where leaders answer 7 questions on leadership, and it's open to anyone in the world to read those answers. And I regularly facilitate global leadership roundtables. In fact, tonight I'll be doing a webinar for all of the school and college leaders in the UK. That's really a talk based on those roundtables. And I'm most present on LinkedIn if you want to connect over there. What we really do at Clarity Group Global is we try to help leaders build the type of workplace culture that employees would move cities to work in. So the goal is, how do you build that kind of environment where someone goes, oh my goodness, if a job opened up there, I'd consider moving my whole family to a different city. I know that's not easy. It's really hard. It takes a lot of intentionality and a lot of time, but that's what we really specialize in. So one of the most exciting things about doing, a presentation like this is I do have a free download for you of my ebook. Excuse me. You can get it as a paperback on Amazon or listen to it on Audible. But if you want to just download the ebook for free, scan this QR code. I'll leave this up here for a little bit while I talk to start today's webinar. But feel free to fill out that form and download the ebook, and you can read that in your own time. So when it comes to managing difficult employees and having difficult conversations, what we're going to talk about today, I just want to tell you a story of where this book came from and my own experience around doing this. I remember I was standing in a group of leaders, and my boss stepped in, and everyone knew he was about to announce who was going to get the promotion. There was going to be someone who was going to step into the role as his 2IC. And so everyone was waiting with bated breath to hear who was going to get this promotion. So as he stepped in and he gave the prologue, I was standing there knowing it was going to be me. He had already told me I was going to get this opportunity. And so I remember feeling this excitement when he told everyone, yeah, Jonno's going to be stepping up the role, and everyone's, clapping politely. A couple of people look a bit disgruntled because there was someone else who might have gotten the role. And for me, I thought, man, this is going to be amazing. People are going to love me. Um, I'm going to be, and I wouldn't have necessarily articulated it like this, but I thought up to that point, I'd managed people before, but I had never really, like, it was usually a tick box kind of opportunity. So this was my first time really where I was given something to lead, and I was going to be in charge in actually in the nonprofit I was a part of. I had 30 volunteers that I was going to be leading in this role. So not even employees, volunteers. And so I thought to myself, man, you know what? If I just do my job really well, if I can just keep learning all these different skills, which had gotten me to this point as an individual contributor, then everyone's going to follow me into the sunset. And so a couple of months later, I'm standing in the room with my 30 volunteers. I'd been in this role for about 2 months. And I look around the room, and this time I have the most disgusting, like, pit of your stomach, anxiety, stress moment, because I look around this room, I'm only a couple of months in, and I realize, oh my goodness, I have no idea how to get these people rowing in the same direction. I do not know how to get these 30 volunteers going anywhere. And the reason this was so disappointing and I felt so confused and frustrated is is because I didn't know where to start. I kind of had been doing everything I knew to do, and I get to this point, I look around, and I think these people are amazing. They're passionate, they're amazing people, and I am completely lost as to how to get them going in the same direction. And so as part of that moment over the next couple of weeks, I'm really trying to work out what am I going to do about this. And I came across another book, a book written by a guy named Patrick Lencioni. And Patrick Lencioni is from the Table Group, and he wrote this book called The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. You might have heard of that book, or you might have even read that book. For me, I felt like Patrick Lencioni had sat down and written, "Dear Jonno White, here's everything you're stuffing up with your team." I mean, I was completely, as I read this, I'm going, oh man, I have dropped the ball here. I haven't even created a team. There's no clarity around who does what. I don't even have a leadership team among my, and so for me, that was a pivotal moment. I read this book, and then I finally had an idea of how to move forward. So I started making changes. I started doing this, building a leadership team and going on this journey. And along the way, I also engaged a leadership coach. He's a guy I knew. He ran a multi-million dollar business, and he started coaching me. And he's an amazing leader. But a few months in, I remember I met with him, and finally we talked about, I'd done lots of things to build my team, but there were a couple of people. I remember one of these guys on my team, I had these different reports that I needed people to do. And I remember I handed him one that he was going to fill out. And as he walked away from me, he crumpled it up and threw it in the bin. And I was just like, oh my goodness. So I'm dealing with some people on my team who just were not buying in. I felt like everyone else was, but these guys are just not buying in. And this guy, my coach, is like, Jonno, you've got to deal with these toxic employees. This is your job as a leader. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to have the guts to deal with these leaders and in my team. And so I sought some other guidance, and this is what I want to say as I explained today the framework in my book, Step Up or Step Out. At this point, I just want to highlight that I was doing I really feel like I'm a nice guy. So I really wanted to do the right thing. And I was trying to be nice, and I was trying to work out how to be kind. But these little moments had happened. I hadn't dealt with them. And all of a sudden, I now felt like I had to deal with a couple of toxic members of my team. And so what I did is I decided it was going to be for the best of everyone. I had this plan that I'm going to just talk these guys through stepping off the team. And I thought, you know what? They must realize that they're miserable. They're really unhappy with me. It's so obvious. It's really creating a terrible culture. I'll have these conversations. I'm imagining sitting down with them and them going, you know what? Yes, you're right. I'm not happy. I'm miserable. I'll go. So I sit down with the first guy and we go out for we sit down for dinner and we're chatting. And I'm there telling him, thinking this moment is going to be this beautiful moment of connection where he goes, yeah, you know what? Um, and we're sitting there. It was actually not dinner. We were out afterwards. So we're having, coffee at about 8 p.m. And I'm telling him how I feel. And I start seeing this defensiveness build. And I start seeing this rage being held back. And over the next hour, he just gives it to me. Basically, what happens, I feel like it flies out of my control. And I end up, he accuses me of firing him, which in hindsight is what I was doing. I was firing a volunteer. And so I'm trying to get control back of it. I'm trying to explain I had the best motives and it just goes haywire. And we leave. There are tears. It's just like, whoa, terrible. I have my next meeting the next morning and I'm thinking, well, this one will go better because this guy had already said that he was going to leave. And I convinced him to stay. And so I go out for coffee the next morning and I'm thinking it can't go any worse than last night. I sit down and once again I compose myself and I think, okay, how am I going to start this? What can I do differently so that it doesn't go as poorly as last night? And before I can get a word in, before our coffees arrive, he looks at me and he says, so, am I next on your hit list? And I just remember being like, oh no, I did not factor in that these guys are really good friends. The guy last night has called this guy. My chance of this going well has just blown up in smoke. And it went about as badly as you can imagine. He felt once again like I was firing him. And in hindsight, I was because I hadn't done anything to this point. And then all of a sudden, I was trying to get them to smoothly stop volunteering and move out. I was effectively firing these two volunteers. It created all sorts of problems in my team. Took us about 12 months to recover from that. It blew up to the point where years later, I was at a wedding. And as happens, I'm at a wedding with one of these guys where we're both guests because we're in this similar circles. There's some friendships. Oh my goodness. And I know I'm going to see him and it's in the back of my mind, but I'm going to get over it, Jonno. And as I see him, I think I'm going to be the bigger man and and I go, as I'm passing him, I say, hey, and I go to shake his hand and he doesn't shake my hand. He just walks past me. And for the first time in my life, I realized, you know what? I think he literally hates my guts. And that's when I realized I started off as a leader thinking that leadership was going to be about people loving me. And really, what I learned through that experience, even though I had the best intentions, even though I was trying to be nice to everyone, leadership is actually about, I believe, great leadership is about being willing to be hated by someone. And in my case, I think I did it really poorly. And I'm going to tell you about that and how to do it better than I did. But that was a massive revelation for me to go, okay, well, if I'm serious about this leadership stuff, maybe it's less about people thinking Jonno's awesome and more about being willing to do the hard work, to make the decisions, even if someone hates my guts, to go, I'm willing to do that. So that was a big revelation for me. However, at the time, as big as that revelation was, it didn't make it any easier. And I remember sitting under a tree crying by myself. And I was in tears partly because I had really hurt these two guys. And for me, that was devastating. Partly because I felt the pain of feeling like people really hated my guts. But I think at a deeper level, I was frustrated that I had tried my best and done what I thought was the right thing. And it had blown up in my face so spectacularly. And that was when I was like, there has to be a better way. How can I learn to deal with this kind of, toxic behavior in a better way? There has to be a way to deal with difficult people that doesn't blow up in my face. And so that's where the book came out of. And what I want to start with before I tell you the story of how I want to tell you another story soon of what I did with another person that ended completely differently. So I'll tell you that in a moment. But what I talk about in the book is, why did this go so poorly? Because, like I said, I'm a nice guy and I had the best intentions. And you might be the same. When it comes to conflict, you'll think, I had the best intentions. I didn't mean for that to blow up. Why did that conversation turn into World War II? Like, where did that defensiveness come from? So I call this a recipe for disaster. Unintentionally, as leaders, we combine the following four ingredients and we create for ourselves the ultimate, works every time recipe for massive confrontation and disaster. The first ingredient we put in there is unclear expectations. And so this happens when someone starts and we think, you know what? They're a good person. I'm a good person. I'm busy. I could sit down and go through everything in lots of detail, but I don't want to micromanage. I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be that girl. And so you let it go and you're unclear. And what happens is you're not that clear at the start, and then some behaviors pop up a bit here, a bit there, and you think, oh, I don't want to micromanage. I don't want to be the mean boss, so I'll let that go. Or we think, I don't know how to address that, and so it just passes, and we think, I'll move on. And then what happens is sometimes this happens in a week, sometimes a month. More often it's months, 3 months, 9 months. Sometimes I meet with leaders where it's been going on for 5 years. These little behaviors keep popping up and we don't deal with them. But then something, the second ingredient is something causes us to have what I call a one-off big battle. Sometimes it's our boss saying, you need to deal with that. Sometimes it was me, it was my partly my coach saying, Jonno, based on everything you're saying, you have to deal with this toxic behavior. I felt like that was a line in the sand moment. I had to do something about it. Sometimes it's a colleague of that person. Please, oh my goodness, deal with Jeff. He's driving me insane. You have to do something. Or they cross a line. There's a non-negotiable. They drop a ball that's so important that you can't ignore it anymore. And what we do as leaders is we go, that's it. And I think what we say to ourselves, definitely what I said to myself, is they must realize, surely Jeff knows how incompetent he is. you know, surely Julie realizes just how difficult she is to work with. And so we think, well, you know what? I'll do the right thing. Let's organize a meeting. So we sit down with this person and we just want to talk to them. We don't want it to be a one-off big battle, but when you look at it, that's what we've done. And that's when the third ingredient gets thrown in, the element of surprise. You're telling them something that is so obvious that you think surely they realize everything that's happening. But they look at you with those eyes, the eyes of complete shock. They say something to you like, but I thought I was doing a good job. And you say, well, yeah. I'm not saying you're doing a completely bad job. I'm just saying this one area, for the past, and then we start generalizing, for the past year, I noticed that you've been a bit, short in some of your conversations with, we start generalizing, they get defensive. And all of a sudden, I had someone on my podcast and we were talking about this, and she said, you know what, there's this Korean word, which I need to find again because I can't remember what it is, but she said there's a Korean word that means two things at once. It means surprise and ambush. And I went, yeah, that's exactly what we do. It's not just the surprise. The person feels ambushed. In that moment, suddenly we go from trying to be the caring boss to just deal with something little. This one-off big battle turns into, this is our recipe. And then the fourth ingredient, so I called the book Step Up or Step Out, How to Deal with Difficult People, Even If You Hate Conflict. But most people aren't difficult. A lot of people are just different to us. So the personalities are different. Often it's once we change the expectations, as we'll talk about, it changes everything. But there are difficult people. And I always say, if you've never been around a difficult person, maybe you are the difficult person. I don't know. But I have had people say to me, oh, you know what? I've never dealt with anyone who is difficult. And then some of the stories I hear in my coaching, oh my goodness, there are crazy employees out there who are, you just hear the stories and you think there is nothing I can take from that other than they wanted to undermine. Like it seems like my point is there are truly difficult people. What makes those people so difficult? I wonder if you've ever thought that. Why are difficult people so difficult? And the answer is the fourth ingredient, as you can see in my little picture there of all the nice ingredients which go together to create the recipe for disaster. This is a bag of mold. So this is the thing that just stuffs everything up. When you have someone who's actually a truly difficult person, it's way harder. It's so challenging to deal well with them because they bring into the equation unrealistic expectations. This is that person where you think, I don't know what planet you're living on. How on earth could you see that in that way? This is where, when I coach leaders, I hear about authentically, there may be a person on their team with a personality disorder. This is where you get things like narcissism or uh, people's family of origin, where they've never had any experience dealing in a healthy way with any type of conflict, and you kind of feel like you completely lose them. They completely lose the plot. Um, like I said, this is the minority. A lot of people, I say 95% of the time, in terms of what I'm going to run you through, that person that you're dealing with will either step up and change their behavior or step out and leave within 4 weeks. And I've seen that happen again and again and again. But when there's a truly difficult person, that is the ingredient that makes it really hard for you. So just be aware, if you have someone on your team who's really truly difficult, that's where the conversations become so, so challenging. So they're the 4 ingredients. We start with unclear expectations. We end up in this, we unintentionally create a one-off big battle. We bring in that surprise and ambush all at once. The person gets super defensive. It all blows up in our face, and we think, where did I go wrong? And if they're really, really a truly difficult person, it's because of their unrealistic expectations. And so I just want to take you through this graph quickly. And this is when it comes to difficult conversations and having conflict, a lot of people ask me, okay, so what should I say in the conversation? And as you'll see in a moment, the key to difficult conversations and the key to dealing with a difficult person or just someone who's different than us that we're finding challenging is really it's all about what happens before the conversation. I'm sorry that's the case. I'm going to give you a different type of difficult conversation to have in a moment, so stay tuned for that. Um, but it's much less about the actual conversation, because if you've set up a one-off big battle and you've got surprise and ambush, I've got bad news for you. There's almost no chance of it going well. As you'll see, how clear are the expectations? In the bottom left, this is where it's really unclear. You're going to have an incredibly painful conflict. So how clear the expectations are will correlate, directly to how painful the conflict is. But when you go all the way over here, even when you have the clearest expectations possible for you and for them, it's still not a zero. And so one of the things I have to talk to leaders about again and again is, yes, unclear expectations is going to give you very painful conflict. But even when you have very clear expectations, when it comes to a difficult conversation, we need to get over this idea that this myth that we can somehow have a difficult conversation and it's going to be completely utopia and beautiful and everyone's smiling and high-fiving. It's always going to be a little bit awkward. But if you can make your expectations super clear, then that pain, the pain of that conflict, how awkward it is going to be way less. But it will always be a bit uncomfortable and a little bit painful. So I just had this experience. I'm sitting under the tree crying, going to myself, I will never do that again. I will never, ever, no matter what, I'm going to find a way that I never have to go through that again, because, hey, I'm a bit conflict avoidant, and I've now created 2 people who are walking down the street literally hating my guts. And it's just, I need to find a better way. So as I'm listening to a podcast, Patrick Lencioni was talking, and as you can hear, he's been a big influence on me. I love his work, and he was talking about this idea of clear expectations, and that's when I heard him talk about this idea of changing these expectations and seeing someone step up or step out in 4 weeks. And I thought he'd been consulting and going through this with people for 20 years. And I thought, yeah, that sounds good, but I'm not sure. But I took some of the principles that he talked about, and I had, at that point, a little bit of time had passed, and I had another guy on my team. He and I had a friendship, so we already had this gray area of friendship, but also he was, working for me. And there were some behaviors in the team he was leading, they just weren't leaning in. We were doing a lot of different events and things, and his whole team, the culture was off. Every other team was kind of leaning in. We were all going in the same direction, but his team kind of leaning out, and I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew I knew there were some behaviors around his leadership and his team that had to change. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to do what I did last time. And so what I decided to do is I decided to try a different process. And so I'm going to take you through this process, how to deal with difficult people. So what I did differently this time is, instead of going and having a one-off big battle, instead of going and having the difficult conversation where I just kind of go in there and bring the surprise and the ambush, what I did instead is I had a different type of difficult conversation, which I call the self-deprecating apology. So I'll take you through this in a moment, these 3 steps. But the self-deprecating apology works particularly well because when you go to have a conversation with someone, as soon as you say, here's what's wrong with you, you're automatically off kilter. There's something, there's no way to hide, no matter whether you say 5 positive things before it and 5 after it, and you sandwich it. I don't care what you do. It's People can read through that. And when it comes across as an out of nowhere criticism, it's just always, in my experience, going to be a negative experience. It's just how bad it is. You can minimize how bad it is, but it's still bad. The self-deprecating apology is so powerful because what I realized with this guy on my team was I had something to apologize for. I realized that I hadn't clarified the expectations. I hadn't been as clear as I could. And that was on me. And I decided to try that. And so I sat down with him and we had that friendship as well. And so I actually said, you know what, I just want to say, I I'm sorry. One thing I really want to work on as a leader is how clear my expectations are. And I've been reflecting recently, going, I don't know if I've ever really clarified them as well as I could have. And so I want to work on that. And I want to get really clear with you. And to my surprise, it was a bit of an awkward conversation. He's kind of wondering where I'm going, but he was actually really okay with that. I think it's because I was coming to him, letting my walls down and not bringing up everything that had ever happened, but actually saying, here's something I want to work on. And he lent in. He's like, yeah, yeah, okay. And so what we did together is we talked through the expectations. We got clear on those things together. And I said to him as well, I just want to say that one thing I want to commit to do is I'm not going to be a chicken. If I see something, and I see something different, I'm going to try not to be a coward. I'm going to go there. I'm going to bring it up and have a little conversation with you about it. And he's like, awesome. Yeah, that's great. And so I said, okay, let's, go away and have a think about it. And then we'll come back together. And we met again and he was really on board and away we went. And I thought, oh my goodness, that was revolutionary. Suddenly I've created these really clear expectations and it didn't blow up everywhere. We're winning. And so a week or two goes by and I'm at an event. And then in the corner of my eye, I see him with his team. And they're doing exactly one of the things we had talked through around the expectations. We had talked through, when we're at an event, we're doing something, I really need your team to be leaning in and contributing and involved 100%. And he was like, yeah, absolutely. And I see in this moment that they're off to the side. Everyone else is involved in something and they're not leaning in, helping us with this event. And I'm like, oh no, this is where the rubber hits the road. And I'd promised him that I would go and have these conversations. And so I'm like, here we go. So I start moving. I'm thinking through, how am I going to bring it up? What am I going to say to him? And I start walking towards him and I get a few steps in and I turn around. I just chicken out. I'm like, I can't do it. It's too awkward. I obviously was going to have to just pull him away from his team and it was just going to be uncomfortable, even though it was only little. And I take a few steps the other direction. But then I remember sitting under that tree. I remember feeling like I'd hurt those guys so bad. I remember being at that wedding and going to shake this guy's hand, and he just doesn't even shake my hand and doesn't acknowledge me and walks past me. I remember turning up to a cafe in my car and getting out and seeing this guy with his family walking into that cafe and going, you know what, I don't need this today. Getting back in my car and driving to another cafe. I remember those moments. And I think, I'm not doing that again. I will not go there again. And so I pluck up the courage. I turn around and I walk over to him. And I say, hey, can I just grab you for a second? I take him somewhere where his team can't hear us, so it's a bit private. And I have this little difficult conversation where I say to him, hey, I remember I promised you I'd do this. And I just have this little conversation, and it's uncomfortable. It's awkward. He's not a fan of what's happening, even though we had talked about it. He's not like, thanks, man. He's pushing back a bit defensive. And but I stick to my guns. I have the awkwardness, and then I walk off. And he goes back to his team. And over the next 2 or 3 weeks, I do this again and again, just little moments, not embarrassing him in front of his team, but just taking him aside. And then he books a meeting with me. And I'm like, oh no, here we go. What's going to happen? Is this all going to blow up in my face? And we're sitting down over a coffee and I'm waiting. Am I going to get another, am I on the hit list, moment where, and I'm sitting there sipping my coffee and he clears his throat and he says, hey, Jonno, just want to let you know, good news. I mean, I've really enjoyed being part of this team here, but I've actually decided I'm going to move over to that over other department, and I've got the okay to do that. I'm going to go and I'm going to start working over there. And I'm like, oh man, that's yeah, oh wow. Well, authentically, and this is where you have to be real and authentic. I was committed that if he was on board, I would have helped him get to where um, we needed to be. But at the same time, I was able to say to him, you know what? Because we had this friendship, he wasn't a terrible guy. It was just there was just some, some unclear things that weren't working well together. And I was able to support him in that. And then I was able to support him as he transitioned out. We trained someone else up and he moved over there and we stayed friends. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is a miracle. And that's when I knew I was onto something. And so, what happened is I articulated this, I had this framework, right? And then as I started coaching leader after leader after leader, when I started Clarity, I realized that at one point I looked at all my sessions and I realized, hang on a second, 50% of these sessions, I'm taking people through these 3 steps that I'm about to take you through. Like 50%, 1 out of every 2 sessions, this is coming up. What's keeping you up at night? And people are saying, you know what? For me, it's this person I'm dealing with right now, and I'm coaching them through this. And because I'm coaching them through it, I'm using different analogies. They're pushing back. I'm answering their questions. And I realized, oh my goodness, I have so many stories, so many anecdotes. The framework has been crystallized through great questions by my coaching clients. And that's when I wrote the book. And since I've written the book, I've had testimonials from Romania and Morocco and the UK and South Africa. I remember one from Morocco where he said, Jonno, thank you so much. In 4 weeks, I saw one person change their behavior and step up, and another one decided to leave. I had 2 people, and they both like literally one stepped up, one stepped out. And so I've had that's why I think it's resonated so much with people. And I've seen story after story after story where it's worked. And so I'm just going to take you through this quickly. Like I said, I'll put that QR code up again if you want to go through it in a bit more depth. The book is only 62 pages long, so it's a quick read, but it gives you a little bit more detail. The first thing I want to say when you're dealing with someone on your team, the first thing I do when I'm with a coaching client is I get them to start by giving a score out of 10 for the following question. I'm 100% clear on, let's say, Jeff. I'm 100% clear on Jeff's expectations in their role. I want you to give yourself a score as a leader out of 10 if this is where you're starting. How clear are you on what Jeff's expectations are in his role? When I do this with clients, I'm amazed at how often it's a 5 or a 7. Sometimes I get leaders who are actually 9 or a 10, and I think that's amazing. I know for me, I was a 5 or below. Like I was really hadn't done as well as I could have done. And then I want you to give a score of what you think Jeff's score would be, from Jeff's shoes. How clear is Jeff on what the expectations are for him in his role? And what do you think that score would be? Sometimes, if someone's doing a really good job with this, it'll be a 9 or a 10. But this is where you get a lot of 2s or 3s. And this is where a lot of my clients, when we're sitting there, they go, to be honest, I don't know if he realizes, you know what, now that I think about it, some of that behavior, I don't know that we've ever really clearly articulated what he should be doing instead. And so the big thing I want you to think about is no matter what, remember what I said before, no matter what the conversation is, if those scores are below, say, a 7, if you're a 5 and they're a 5, your chances of having a good conversation when it comes to that difficult conversation are really low, really low. What you want to do instead is get those scores as high as you can. So step 2 is, before you go anywhere near the actual conversation, get your score up above 7 for yourself and that person. How do you get them up there? You're going to need to clarify the expectations, or sometimes you change the expectations. Which do you need to do? So use the self-deprecating apology. I use that all the time, and I've seen leader after leader after leader use it, where they go in there and they say, hey, I just want to say I'm sorry. I don't think I've been as clear as I could about expectations, and I want to do that better. I want to be really clear. How do you, and then you can even say to them, how clear do you feel like the expectations are? And they might be like, well, I feel like I'm a 10 out of 10. I'm really surprised. Sometimes people aren't as emotionally intelligent or self-aware. Other times they'll say, well, to tell you the truth, it's probably a 4. Like I have been wondering. So that'd be really, really helpful. And this is where you're clarifying for the first time, or re-clarifying. Sometimes you change expectations. Through this conversation, you realize, you know what, to be fair, they're right. There are some things here that I haven't, that aren't realistic. Now, once you've done this process and you get your scores up towards as high as you can for you and for them on the expectations, now we're going to step 3. Ridiculously clear expectations. Now, instead of a one-off big battle, we're going to pick small battles again and again and again. Imagine the big battle like dropping an anvil on their shoe. We've got this anvil and we drop it on their foot, and then they're jumping around screaming, and we're like, what's wrong? Why did that hurt? And instead, what we want to do is we want to put a stone in their shoe. And as human beings, the funny thing about us is, when the stone's in the shoe, there's only so long we'll go, only so far we'll walk before we go, that's it. This thing is so annoying, and we'll take the stone out of our shoe. And so the big test for you in step 3, there should be no surprises. So once you've set up the clear expectations, and you're also going to set up an expectation that you're going to go there and bring anything up with them. So you're going to be completely on the same page. When you bring something up with them and you say, hey, can I have a quick chat to you about, let's just use a really obvious example. Someone's routinely late to meetings or something, and you bring that up with them. You want to see in their eyes, if you see any surprise, like shock that this is happening, go back to step 1. What you want to see is like, yes, and so there's no surprise. You pick small battles. And 95% of the time, when you do this again and again and again, you will see people step up or step out within 4 weeks. I know it sounds crazy, but I've seen it again and again. And Patrick Lencioni was 100% right about that. The other 5% of the time, there are those exceptions to the rule. There are those people who are truly difficult, and there are those people that just hang on. Now, that does happen, but I believe even in those cases, you're in a way better situation. If you need to go to official performance management, if you need to bring HR in, if you need to consider terminating because they've dropped a really significant ball in some way, then I believe you're in a better place to do any of those things well if you've gone through this process. And so I remember I have a client in Canada, and he runs a small engineering company. And so I was on the phone to him, and he said to me, Jonno, look, I'm really just, I've got this person. She's a friend of mine. She already worked with us from a government role, and she started, as a client of ours in what we did. We were working together, us in the engineering, her in the government, and we got on so well that she started working for us 2 years ago. Now, the problem is that we're just at a place in our business. It's a small business. Everyone has to wear lots of hats. Everything has to be 110 kilometers an hour because that's how you survive. It's small business. And it's a couple of years in, but she's just not cutting it. So I think I need to let her go. And at this point, he was set on letting her go. And he was worried because she was a really good friend, and that's how they'd come to work together. And personally, they really liked, they had so much respect for each other, but professionally, it just wasn't working. And as a business owner, he had reached that line in the sand where he was like, I have to do something about this because I can't keep having her like that kind of, to put it in a harsh way, that kind of dead weight in the small business was just getting to a point where it wasn't going to work. And so he said to me, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let her go. What do you think? And I thought, you know what, when someone's in that position, normally, no matter what I say, they do what they think they need to do from experience. But I thought, well, I'll try anyway because I did know him well. And I said, well, can I give you another option? And he said, okay, yeah, yeah, I'm willing to consider. I'm like, okay. I said, instead of going in there and just letting her go, um, what if you actually run this process? And I took him through this process. And I said, instead of going in there and having this big one-off, either letting you go or performance managing you, why don't you actually have a conversation about the expectations? And in this case, we workshopped it together. And to my surprise, I was waiting to hear him say, no, I'm still going to do it. But he said, you know what, Jonno, I will. I'll actually try doing it your way. We'll see how it goes. I was like, okay, I'm keen to hear how this goes. So what he did is he sat down with her and he said, look, I just want to tell you where we're going as a business. We've been kind of here as a small business, but we're gonna to survive and thrive, we're gonna have to go to another level. And he believed this authentically. He said, I believe you can go there. And I just want to say that I'm willing to push you, to coach you. You know, we have that friendship. Like if we're going to go there as a business, then I'm going to have to do this with everyone. We're going to have to go to another level. It may not be easy, but if you're in, then I'll help you kind of go there. But I just wanted to really get clear about that because it is going to be a shift up a gear. And they had this conversation, and she was a bit cagey as you are in a conversation like that, but it was authentically him taking the performance management, the firing her off the table, and starting the conversation about where the business was at and how they were going to just have to go to another level. So he called me after that, and he was saying, "Oh, she was a bit cagey, I don't know." And I thought, "Oh, interesting." Anyway, he calls me the next day. He says, "Jonno, you won't believe it. She called me this morning, and she said to me, you know what? I had to think about it overnight, and I think now that I'm reflecting on it, I think that the role I had in government going here, I just don't know if I'm handling the pace of the small business and what we need to do. And going to another level, I don't know that I can do it. And I'm thinking maybe it would be best for me to go back into the public sector." And he told me how he was able to say, you know what, if that's what you want to do, I will support you 110% and help you make that happen. And so in that case, he was able to actually help her with her resume process, interviews. She had lots of network and connections in there over the next 2 or 3 months as she transitioned out of the business and that she trained someone else up. She found this next role and transitioned back into government. And she's still in government, actually doing really well in the public sector. And I tell that story because when you actually go and you do this process, sometimes it doesn't always go that smoothly, but I've seen again and again and again that instead of ending up in a place where you have this massive confrontation, it all blows up in your face. You have people walking down the street literally hating your guts. There is a way to do it better. There is a way as leaders. And this is why I believe, in terms of grace and dignity, we confused nice and kind. I confused nice and kind. I thought I was being nice to these guys when I didn't clarify expectations, when I didn't go there and have the little conversations. But clear is kind, you know, clear is kind. Nice and kind are not always the same. I was being unkind to them, and I actually set up a really painful experience. And so, what I want to leave you with today, once again, there's the QR code if you want to download the free copy of my ebook, Step Up or Step Out. Is how can clear is kind. How can you be clear? How can you be kind? And make sure you do all that work before the actual difficult conversation so that you get the best result for yourself and for the other person on the other side of the table from you.
Jono, thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. Um, I don't see that there's any questions, but I'm going to be a question asker just to
Sure.
keep the conversation going for a few minutes. Um, and look, this is probably coming firstly from a place of really resonating with what you have said today, particularly in the context of my own journey as a leader, and I'm sure that's probably mirrored with quite a few people that's on the call today. Um,
Mm,
but just interested in your thoughts on how establishing this kind of clarity is related to your authority as a leader in the workplace and the respect that you gain in your position of authority by being clear. And I ask that because a long time ago in my first leadership role, one of the things that I learnt from not being clear up front with people and in being the nice guy and being very permissive is that actually really eroded my authority in the workplace. I just wonder if you've got any other comments on that.
Yeah, I love that. It's a great point. I think there's a truth across all of business and probably life, which is um, when we overpromise and underdeliver, we erode trust. And we can all think of, when it from 240 episodes on my podcast, I always ask leaders about mentors or role models. And it's amazing. One thing I've noticed is people again and again and again bring up this idea of someone having their back. And it's like, if a leader doesn't have my back, if they say one thing, but then it's not really true, or then when the rubber hits the road, they don't actually have my back and they throw me under the bus, that is like, that's come across to me as kind of the most constant theme, and vice versa. A leader who has my back. And I think part of having my back that people are talking about is being willing to tell me the hard truth, and being confident enough in myself and my identity, where I'm not a people pleaser, to actually tell you, to give you that tricky piece of feedback, to tell you the honest truth, and so under promise, over deliver. I think as leaders, one of my favorite stories about this I had on my podcast is a leader who said he was years and years into his journey as a leader, and he had a close mate that was on his team. And so they had this great, really close friendship, camaraderie. But it also meant that for the first time ever, his mate said to him one time, "You know what?" And he shared this on the podcast. He'd be happy for me to say his name, but his name's Jason. And his mate said to him, "Hey, Jason, sometimes I feel like you're holding on to stuff. I just feel like sometimes you haven't told me the whole story. And I don't know, it just creates a bit of this ick, like, and it shouldn't be there. Like, we've known each other so long, and I think you're a great leader." And Jason, because they had this such strong relationship, was like, "You know what? You're probably right. There have been little things, but I didn't want to make a big deal of it." And this other guy was able to say to him, "Well, I reckon that when you don't say anything, or you hold on to it, I can kind of sense that there's something you're not telling me, and it actually creates this barrier." And so this was years ago, and this guy on my podcast, Rachel's his name is, sorry, Jason said to me, "You know what? After that moment, I made a conscious decision that when I saw something, not in, once again, not in a micromanagement way. I'm not talking about someone who's just walking around hitting everyone with like negative criticism. There's a great ratio 5 to 1 that is used more in a relationship setting, but I think it works really well. 5 positive to every 1 negative across the board, so, but he said, "I realized in that moment that when I held on to some of those negative pieces of feedback, I actually was carrying them, and they could kind of tell. So I started making sure that I would give that little piece, even if it was, I would pass that on. And once that cleared the air and he felt like he had really told them where he stood, it actually created even more freedom in his leadership, and he felt like his people knew with certainty that they knew where he stood about them, and that actually helped him lead even more effectively."
Fantastic. Now, having asked that question, that's triggered a few questions coming through the
Love it.
Q&A. So we'll try and get through as many of these as possible um, with the time that we've got left. The first is, in what circumstances do you think it would be prudent to have another person in the room, either a support person on their side or HR rep or leader on yours?
This is such a good question. And it's really a very tricky question because it really depends how litigious the context is that you're in. So as an example, I was just with a group in Palm Springs in California 3 weeks ago, and they're in the nonprofit space, working in the community, just working in with people with autism in California. Incredibly litigious, just very challenging sector, very challenging context, even more litigious than Australia. So you've got to look at risk. I'd say ideally, right? Ideally, you as soon as you have other people in the room, it just ups the stakes. And what we really want to do, particularly when we're having that first conversation to clarify expectations, is we want to actually lower the stakes as much as we can. So where possible, I would, and that's why some people say, "Oh, I hate hallway conversations because you catch people off guard. It's better to have a formal meeting." But once again, the thing about hallway conversations is I think they can lower the stakes. So you've got to weigh up the risk, though. Sometimes you'll be in a setting, you'll be, whether it's a company where there's a history of litigation, whether you have a very, very active union, or and you just know that it's actually best for all parties to have witnesses. Sure, I understand that, and that's wisdom, I think. But wherever possible, you want to lower the stakes and make it as stone in the shoe as you can. As soon as you got more people in the room, it can create a bit more of that anvil feeling, like there's way more at stake. And I've seen that before as well, where it wasn't necessary to have other people in the room, but because you had people who were quite heightened, they wanted to have people in the room, and it actually was unhelpful. At the same time, I've seen where people should have had other people in the room. So sorry that's such a vague question, but it's really case by case specific, and particularly where you're in a a litigious setting, or it's high risk, then follow your gut and have additional people in the room, even if it makes the everything a little bit harder. It might be wise for you.
So maybe quickly flowing on from that, if you have an anvil to address, how do you build up to it with stones while the big problem is alive and festering?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. It's a good way to put it. Yeah, I mean, sometimes there's exceptions to the rule, right? So sometimes you're listening and you're going, "Oh man, I've got something to deal with," but it is actually a non-negotiable, or something happens where, as an example, you know, there was a school in New Zealand, and for some health and safety things, they had a death on site where someone um actually died on site because of some health and safety problems. Now, before that happening, when it comes to something like that with health and safety and the dangers of literally life or death, you just got to drop the anvil. Sometimes you do. Sometimes, now, if it's not life or death, and it's not something you have to deal with, that's where the self-deprecating apology can be so helpful, because it opens up the conversation to get really clear together, and then it allows you the space to have them agree and commit that you're going to go in there and start putting the stone in the shoe. Um, Often what I've found is that yeah, you either, if you need to drop the anvil because it's a non-negotiable, or it's literally life or death or very high risk, then there's no way around that, and you've just got to deal with it as best you can. And but if at all possible, try to go the stone in the shoe perspective, because the ironic thing is the anvil tends to create this massive explosion that doesn't really get them to step up or step out. It often just creates almost two enemies that are against each other. And whereas the stone in the shoe creates the momentum over the next 4 weeks, where they will often change behavior or step out. So even if it feels like an anvil, if it's not life or death, if it's not non-negotiable, then trying to go the stone in the shoe route and see if that actually deals with the what you feel like is an anvil level thing, is my recommendation. And I've been shocked. I coach leaders on this again and again and again. Human beings cannot handle little accountability conversations. You want to, like, we think that if you wanted to punish someone, a human being, they're like, when it comes to having a little awkward conversation where someone's calling us on something, and it's twice, third time, fourth time, there is something about that. Like, we don't want to humiliate the person, but what we do want to do is create uncomfortableness so that that leads to change. And the anvil, for some reason, will break the foot, but it often doesn't lead to that change. Whereas the stone in the shoe, those little conversations, people just cannot handle that for long before changing something or even choosing to step out.
So just a couple of minutes left. One final question. I would like to know Jono's thoughts on how to get clear expectations. Most employees I've had understand what they need to do. It's in their JD and we set KPIs, but they are not clear on the how I want it done or how we work in a fast-moving entrepreneurial environment. When and how should this be communicated to ensure you get off on the right foot?
Well, it's easiest if you've got someone starting, and I think you've hit the nail on the head. The job description, the KPIs, you're already doing that really well. So I would be thinking about in that initial discussion, how can you get as clear as possible on how you want it done and how you work? Like, how can you actually make that part of the initial meeting? This is what you need to do. These are your KPIs. Now, we're not this type of business, we're this type of business, which means we operate like this, you know. So I would be saying sometimes I've seen this in small business is that over promise, under deliver, right? What we do is we say, oh yeah, you can come in and just do this. Wow, yeah, we really want you to bring your expertise. The reality is they need to wear 5 hats. So we need to change that to say, look, we want you to be in your expertise, we want you to be focusing on that. We are a small business, you're going to be wearing 5 hats. That might stress you at times, that might stretch you at times. I'm here to support you in that. Once we make that clear and we've talked it through with them, then we can actually see, we set it up to actually have those conversations where 2 weeks in and we say, hey, I noticed this week you like I'll give you an example of someone just the other day that had this where there was just something that they had assumed, an event that a person that they brought on into a team, this was a larger company though, they had assumed in their head that they needed to be at this event because it was literally the event that linked to their job description. Like they were leading this thing and they needed to run the meeting for that thing. So in their head, they hadn't even articulated that. It was so obvious. And then they're meeting with me, and the person's 2 months into their role, and they haven't been even attending the event they're meant to run. I mean, it sounds ludicrous, but if you're already doing the job description and KPI as well, you're probably ahead of a lot of us, me included, in the past. I don't know if I did that well. If you can just make the how you work and how you want it done clearer as part of that conversation, um, and then once again, they might push back. They might say, well, I'm a slower person at how I get things done. I'm not a just move at 110%. Okay, well, there's a conversation for you to have. Maybe you need to change expectations. Maybe for that person, no one else gets a briefing ahead of the meeting next week, but they need it. How are you going to change how you work to deal with that? But if you can set that up clearly at the start, then you've set up the conversation where 2 weeks in, you can say, hey, I've noticed you're pushing back on some of these other hats, but that, remember what I said, like here we all have to wear 5 hats. Suddenly you've opened up, and that's just a little conversation. The last thing I'll say, which is one of the most common things I say, is whenever you're doing any of this feedback, you want to be clear, you want to be early, you want to be specific, and you want to be small. You want to be clear. So we want to be really clear about what we're talking about. We're early. We want to get onto it as soon as possible. Don't wait 2 weeks. Wait 2 minutes and bring it up if you can. The earlier, the better. Clearer, specific. So it's not about the past 3 months. I've noticed it's about that one thing. And small. Pick the small thing to have the little conversation about, because that's a really doable first step.
Great. That is almost right on time. Jonno, thank you so much again. Thanks everyone for joining us. For those of you that are coming to Congress in 2 weeks, there's a session that Melbourne Business School are running on negotiation, which is a sort of lateral kind of discussion topic to this. So encourage those of you with an interest in this to get along to that session at Congress. And otherwise, look forward to seeing you all soon. Bye bye.